And thank you for having me, and thank you to our sponsor family for making this Scholar in Residence program possible. It's really an honor. It's a pleasure to be to be doing this for you and for all of you. I've given a few individual, just like a short series before, but chance to really immerse. I'm really looking forward to the opportunity. I should also say that, um, normally this is not what I usually talk about and what I usually write about. I'm more of a historian. My degree is in history, but when I was an undergraduate, my other undergraduate major was music. So I almost became a musicologist. It's something I really enjoy thinking about and talking about. So it's always nice to have the opportunity. The other thing about music and other aspects of culture. The other thing I like when I'm talking about music or movies or television or things like that, when I lecture about this, is we get to avail ourselves of, let's call it the upside of the internet culture in the digital age, by which I mean during the course of these talks, I will be sharing some short video clips with you, which is a nice way, a nice add-on when you're talking about whether it's music or movies or television. I found some useful clips, so I'll be able to set them up, and then we can watch them, and then we can talk about them. But there is a lot to talk about. So this particular series about Jews and music, really what we're going to focus on is mainly the music that Jews from Eastern Europe, their musical tradition that they brought and elaborated in America. Now, this is a vast subject. There are a lot of examples. So each week, when we go from topic to topic, I think you will notice that there are dozens of examples I could have chosen to talk about, to share with you, that I didn't because of the limitations of time. But I've tried to choose the ones that really, the good juicy ones, some of which will be more familiar to you, especially as we move forward, some of which will be less familiar. But I really want to give us the sense of the tapestry, of the complexity and the breadth of this Jewish musical culture. But I think I'd like to start today, before we dive into the topic, I'd like to start with a general question. Since we're talking about Jewish music in America, what do we mean when we say Jewish music? What makes music Jewish? Now, in some ways, in some cases, it's very straightforward. Clearly, music for the synagogue, especially music for the synagogue written in a Jewish language, that's clearly Jewish music. That's an example where there's no question that it's Jewish music. But there are less clear examples as well. Let me put it to you this way. Do we define, for example, any music written by someone Jewish as automatically being Jewish music? Well, the answer may not be as simple as you might think. There was an anti-Semitic German composer in the 19th century named Richard Wagner. I'm sure you've heard of him. And he wrote a book called Jews and Music, and he made the contention that any music written by Jews was inherently Jewish. He was saying it in a very negative way. So when we say, if we want to say that simply because music is written by someone Jewish, it's automatically Jewish, we want to be careful to say it in a way that's not the Wagner way of saying it. We don't want to say it in a racializing sort of way. But it is one of the questions we're going to be looking at in this series. Now, this week, since we're focusing on Yiddish music, that really the beginning of this Jewish musical tradition in America, it's going to be more straightforward. But for example, next week when we talk about Jewish composers writing Christmas music, what are we to say about the Jewishness of that music? Or Aaron Copland writing quintessentially American music. In other words, there are cases where the Jewishness of the music is going to be very clear, and there are cases where it's going to be less clear. And one of the things we're going to try to do is try to explain, when we group everything together that we would consider part of this corpus of Jewish music, why we're including what we're including. That's one of the things we're going to do as we go along. The other thing that we're really going to notice is the diversity and the complexity of this music. We're going to start with music. We're going to start with Yiddish music and Yiddish musical theater. But by the time we get to the end of the series, we're going to be into the realm of rock and roll music and Broadway music. We're going to cover a lot of ground here. This is as diverse as the American Jewish community itself. In some ways, the music of American Jews is a window into the diversity and complexity of the American Jewish experience. So that's in broader terms, that's what we're going to keep in mind as we move through this series, beginning tonight. Now, tonight, as Ari mentioned, this afternoon, as Ari mentioned, we're going to be talking about really the first step in all of this, the music that Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe brought to America and what they did with it in America. Now, I know that's not really the beginning of the story. There were Jews and there was music before the Eastern European Jews came. There was the synagogue music and the German Jewish folk. Yes, but this is where I want to start, mainly because this is what interests me the most, and this is what I think I think this is a very interesting part of the story. So when we talk about this, a useful place to start is what I call in the midst of what historians call transplanting the shtetl from Eastern Europe to America. By which I mean, whenever we talk about Jews immigrating, migrating from place to place, we're not only talking about people moving. We're not only talking about, leaving Anatevka and coming to the New World. We're also talking about Jews transplanting their culture and their identity and their sense of community from one place to the other. They don't bring everything with them in terms of culture, in the same way that they don't bring all of their possessions with them. But there are the things that they deem to be most valuable and most meaningful, they tended to bring with them. And in the case of music, this could not be truer. What Jews are going to bring with them are the musical sounds and the songs and the type of music that really moved them back in Eastern Europe. And since we're talking about Jews coming from Eastern Europe, much of what was most meaningful to them was music that was sung in Yiddish. Transplanting the shtetl, first and foremost, meant bringing Yiddish culture and Yiddish language from Eastern Europe to America. So let me make sure it's clear when we say Yiddish culture, what I mean by that. Yiddish for Jews who lived in the shtetl, as you may know, was more than simply the language of the street. It was more than simply the language that the overwhelming majority of Jews spoke in Eastern Europe. Yiddish was a whole culture, and during the second half of the 19th century, in other words, in the decades leading up to that mass migration of Jews from Eastern Europe to America that began in the 1880s, during the decades leading up, the Yiddish language and Yiddish culture itself in Eastern Europe underwent a profound transformation. Beginning around the year 1850 in Eastern Europe, we have the invention of what came to be known as modern Yiddish culture. Some called it secular Yiddish culture. Yiddish, which, like I said, been the language of the street, was reinvented first as a modern literary language. Jews who always spoke Yiddish, they began to use Yiddish in ways they had never used it before. Yiddish newspapers, Yiddish novels and short stories, as opposed to just, Yiddish mices, just Yiddish tales, or Yiddish religious texts, or Hasidic tales. Yiddish became the focal point of a modern Jewish culture that was largely secular in nature, and epitomized by the great Yiddish writers. For example, the one who went by the name, he was often referred to by the name of one of his literary characters, Mendel Moicher Sforim, Mendel the bookseller. That was Shai Abramovich, Shalom Aleichem, Yud Lamed Peretz. They transformed Yiddish into something new. And from that world, Jews came to America, and they didn't just bring Yiddish to America as a spoken language. They brought Yiddish to America as a modern secular language. Now, this secular language had another dimension to it as well. It became the language of criticism of the traditional Jewish world of the shtetl. It became the language of protest, the language of trying to imagine a Jewish world that was better for Jews. It became the language of political critique. And in America, as in Eastern Europe, this modern Yiddish became the language of political protest. As Jews migrated from the shtetl to the Yiddish neighborhoods, the Yiddish-speaking neighborhoods of North America, especially what came to be known as the Lower East Side of Manhattan, that was these new neighborhoods, these immigrant Jewish neighborhoods, teemed with the Yiddish language, but they also teemed with other facets of this secular Yiddish culture, including Yiddish as a language of protest. So let's start there with an example of what do I mean by Yiddish as a language of social protest for immigrant Jews, the most difficult part of the immigrant Jewish experience in America. Let's make no mistake, this was a difficult thing to do, moving to an entirely different country, oftentimes with nothing, trying to build a life for yourself, for your family, for your children. Most Jews who came to places like New York City, they lived at subsistence level. As you know, they worked tirelessly in sweatshops just to make a living. You know, if you want to really sum up the experience of that first generation of Jewish immigrants, they worked themselves to the bone 16 or 18 hours a day so their children could go to school, so their children could get an education and have a better life, and especially so their children could become Americans. That's what they really wanted. They wanted their children to have the opportunities that this new world presented. Now, they also very quickly became aware that what they expected, the way they envisioned America before they came, you know, the Golden Medina, the golden land where the streets were paved with gold, that turned out not to be the case. They came to America. They lived in crowded immigrant neighborhoods and streets with not that much to eat, with living places that weren't that sanitary, a difficult life, but they saw it as worthwhile. But by the same token, they were among the first voices that lamented the difficulties of this life, a realistic approach to it. So let me give you an example of that. An early Yiddish poet in America, his name was Morris Rosenfeld, and around the year 1910, he reflected on the difficulty of the immigrant Jewish experience, and especially what it meant to work all day in a sweatshop and the contrast between that and the life they expected, in a poem he wrote called in Yiddish, Mein Ruheplatz, my final resting place. Let me recite a little bit of it, and then we'll hear a recording of it. Nit such mich, wo die Myrten grinen, gefindst mich dorten nit, mein Schatz, wo Lebenswelten bei Maschinen, dorten is mein Ruheplatz. Don't look for me where the myrtles are green. You will not find me there, my beloved. Where lives wither at the machines, there is my resting place. This is a working class song, how that tireless labor just drains the spirituality out of you, drains the meaning, the enthusiasm. Nit such mich, wie die Vögel singen, gefindst mich dorten nit, mein Schatz. A Schlaf bin ich, wo Kiten klingen, dorten is mein Ruheplatz. Don't look for me where birds sing. You will not find me there, my beloved. I am a slave where chains ring. There is my final resting place. There are a couple more verses. Ari, let's cue up and let's listen to a recording of Mein Ruheplatz.
Can you see it okay?
Yeah.
Nit such mich wo die Myrten grünen, gefindst mich dort nit, mein Schatz, wo Lebenswelken bei Maschinen, dorten ist mein Ruheplatz, dorten ist mein Ruheplatz. Nit such mich wo die Vögel singen, gefindst mich dort nit, mein Schatz. A Schlaf bin ich, wo Keten klingen, dort such mich Fontanen spritzen, gefindst mich dort nicht mein Schatz. Wo Tränen rinnen, Zähne kritzen, dorten ist mein Ruheplatz. Dorten ist mein Ruheplatz. Und liebst du mich mit wahrer Liebe, du kommst zu mir, mein guter Schatz. Und heiter und mein Herz das triebe und mach mir süß mein Ruheplatz. Mach mir süß mein Ruheplatz. Mach mir süß mein Ruheplatz.
Thank you. You can hear the lament in the song. Now, as Jews became more settled, especially on the Lower East Side of Manhattan, as that culture began to coalesce, it wasn't just about Yiddish songs, but it was the creation of Yiddish cultural institutions, and above all, the emergence of the phenomenon called Yiddish theater. Now, when I say phenomenon, this is what I have to emphasize about it. First of all, it was based on Yiddish theater in Warsaw and a few other cities in Eastern Europe. Actually, Yiddish theater in Eastern Europe had its emergence in a town in Rome, what is today Romania, called Iasi, and eventually made its way to larger cities like Warsaw. But Yiddish theater wasn't just plays in Yiddish. Yiddish theater first in Europe, and then especially in London and New York, was really a new kind of theater. What really hadn't existed, and I don't mean hadn't existed for Jews, but really for anyone, is what today we would call musical theater or musicals. You see, they had operas and they had plays, but no one had fused the two together to create what we would now call the musical. Yiddish theater was really the first to do that. So it wasn't just that Yiddish theater, they have these remarkable performances with orchestra, with elaborate costumes in an elaborate theater, which would sell out every night. What they were doing in Yiddish was something that no one else was doing. Jewish or otherwise, it was something very new. And it's important to emphasize that about Yiddish theater. Now, there were many names associated with the Yiddish theater, but there are a couple in particular I want to emphasize. The first really great Yiddish songwriter, composer and conductor for Yiddish theater was Joseph Rumshinsky. Rumshinsky, he had the standard background. His family came from Eastern Europe to New York. In New York, he tried some odd jobs. Eventually, he began to work and help organize one of the Yiddish theaters in New York, and he began to write music for it as part of these shows. The other important names associated with Yiddish theater that I would really single out, and like I said, there are many. If you Google Yiddish theater in New York, the names will just come up. There was a married couple named Boris and Bessie Tomaszewski. Now, Boris Tomaszewski, this is the guy who's really well known. He became the face of Yiddish theater. I'll just give you an example. If you ever saw the movie or the play, The Producers, originally with Zira Mostel, most recently on Broadway with Nathan Lane, there's a great moment where Bialystok, who's played by Nathan Lane, he's bragging to everyone what a great actor and producer he was. And one of the ways he brags, he says, I even had a chance to work with the great Boris Tomaszewski. Tomaszewski was the guy. Now, Tomaszewski came from Eastern Europe. He became a very popular actor. He was in plays that were musical. He was also especially in plays that weren't musical. Now, he met his wife, Bessie, in a very interesting way. When she was about 14 years old, she came to see one of his Yiddish performances, and she went backstage to see the star of the performance, who she thought was a woman, but actually it turned out it was Boris dressed playing a woman in the play. And they struck up a conversation. They realized they have these common theatrical interests, and eventually they fell in love and became married, and they began to work together. And the Tomaszewskis, in many ways, they took what was a nascent Yiddish theater tradition, using in part the music of Joseph Rumshinsky, and they began to expand it and expand it and expand it. It entered this period of explosion by around the year 1910 or 1920. It really became something quite remarkable. But the underlying parts, what had come as Yiddish music, even Yiddish music of protest, would be woven into the plays. So the kinds of plays they would do, some of them were simply taking popular plays, excuse the dog barking. Some of these would be taking popular plays like Shakespeare or other plays, translating them into Yiddish and performing them that way. Some of them were original plays. Some of them were Jewish plays, like The Dybbuk was a famous one written by Sholem Ansky, and they would perform that. But sometimes they would take a play that didn't have music and they would add musical numbers to it. And in some cases, whatever the story was about, they would add, for example, this mood of social protest. So I want to give you one example there. Rumshinsky, he wrote a song for one of these Yiddish plays called 50-50. And with 50-50, this is a play about a group of working class people who are struggling to survive, and they're longing for a day when, instead of them doing all the work and the boss, the factory owner, getting all the money, one day they'll be able to split the profits 50-50. This is a way of envisioning a better world. Let me read to you a little bit of 50-50. I hope we will live to see the day. The time should only come when there will no longer be any bosses and workers. The socialists will make an end to poor and rich. The bosses and workers will share things equally. Now, in the chorus in this song 50-50, the boss they single out is Cornelius Vanderbilt. Cornelius Vanderbilt was a railroad magnate. If you watch the show Gilded Age on HBO, George Russell is based on Cornelius Vanderbilt. He was one of the big bosses, known as one of the robber barons, who just made tons and tons of money on the backs of workers who were not yet unionized, because there were no unions yet. They were illegal. He paid them as little as he could. He took advantage of the fact that immigrants would work for nothing. But Vanderbilt became the symbol of this equality. And, in the way the chorus, it's 50-50, oi 50-50, Vanderbilt will sit and sweat like an ox, sewing cloaks. That's what equality means. We get a little more so we can afford to have a life. And Vanderbilt, the big fat cat robber baron, maybe he gives a little, maybe he even has to work for a living. Now, this song is more up mood than My Room of Plots, but it's making the same message. So, Ari, why don't we listen to this recording of 50-50? This recording is a more recent recording, when it was from about 20 years ago, I believe. So let's listen to some of 50-50.
Ich hoff, mir will noch de Leben als kennen soll die Zeit.
Wenn es will mehr nicht sein, kein Bosses und Arbeitsleit.
Die Sozialisten will machen nach so viel Urmen reich.
Die Bosses mit der Arbeiter,
Wer sich denn gleich. 50-50, bei 50-50.
Vanderbilt wird wie ein Ochs.
Sitzen, schwitzen, nähen, Klocks. 50-50, wenn wir freien mit tun. Kein Zeit verlieren, schnell am Leben. 50-50. Bei 50-50, 50-50. Vanderbilt wird wie ein Ochs. Sitzen, schwitzen, nähen, Klocks. 50-50, wenn wir freien mit tun. Kein Zeit verlieren, schnell am Leben. 50-50, kein Zeit verlieren, schnell am Leben. 50-50.
Now, songs like 50-50 and My Room of Plots and the other songs that were coming out of Yiddish theater, we have to kind of see them in a context here, because what's happening, especially on the Lower East Side in Jewish neighborhoods, this is the area, this is the period of time, and these are the places where this these massive Jewish workers struggling in sweatshops for a living. This is when they're beginning to organize. They are part of the beginnings of the labor movement, and especially of the organization of labor unions. Now, songs like Mein Ruheplatz and 50-50, they took on greater significance and greater popularity, especially around the year 1911. In 1911, there was a moment here, and this moment is known as the Triangle Waistcoat Fire. In other words, there was a large factory on the Lower East Side where hundreds of especially women worked, most of whom were Jewish women, and a fire broke out in this factory. 150 of them were killed, and the reason was the factory owners, who in this case happened to be Jewish, refused to take any safety precautions, and there wasn't enough government regulation to make them. This is an era before there was any kind of real government or city oversight. And so they had too many women crowded in a room. They didn't have proper fire escapes. Sometimes the doors were locked. So some of the women were killed in the fire. Some of them were killed jumping out of the building. But in the history of the labor movement, this is a significant turning point. In fact, I'll tell you, I had a student last year who, in addition to being a student, she's also a first responder. She's a firefighter. And she told me that in her firefighting training, they learned about that fire. It's an important moment in the development of fire safety and firefighting training. But in the Yiddish world, in this Yiddish world of protest music, songs like 50-50 took on. They were already very popular. But as the labor movement really began to gain some steam and there were labor unions coming into being, these became almost like anthems, and more people came and began to show up and watch these shows. And not only composers like Rumshinsky, but also the actors themselves really began to be swept up into this protest culture. The protest culture wasn't only about, organizing unions. Already in Eastern Europe, there was a broader element to this protest. Remember, I said that the secular Yiddish culture was not only trying to make a better place for Jews in the world, but trying to make the Jewish community fairer, and above all, beginning in Eastern Europe, but even more so here in America, this meant improving the lot of Jewish women. And Bessie Tomaszewski in particular, she used her music and her shows and her performances to make this case for improving the plight of Jewish women. Sometimes she would take existing plays and sort of rewrite them to make this point, and sometimes she would write new ones. Let me give you 3 examples, okay? Bessie Tomaszewski, she starred in a play called Minka the Housemaid. Now, Minka the Housemaid is basically the Yiddish version of Pygmalion, or in musical terms, this is the Yiddish version of My Fair Lady. Minka is a housemaid who the man she works for transforms her into a modern woman, into an intelligent, articulate woman from this, sort of Yiddish-speaking, very hard dialect woman, and then falls in love with her, and then she rejects him, just like Liza Doolittle rejecting Henry Higgins. But for Bessie Tomaszewski, this was a way of saying women in the Jewish community have been oppressed and it's time to liberate them. She wrote another play called Hansi in America. Hansi in America is the story of an immigrant girl who assumes a male identity. So she in order to be allowed to drive a car, so she can basically be a cab driver. That's the employment she wants. And then she also wrote a play called Jenny Runs for Mayor, which was the story of the first woman who became mayor of a town. Now, at the turn of the 20th century, these were all revolutionary ideas. The fact that raising up the status of women in that way, but it was all part of this culture. But I wouldn't want you to think that it's all about protest, because a lot of this music simply was music and simply was beautiful music and uplifting and entertaining and even romantic music. Another poem that Rumshinsky wrote, another song that he wrote for one of these shows or for the Yiddish theater, was a show called Shane V. de Levana, beautiful as the moon. Now, this was not politics. This was not protest. This was simply your standard, let's call it a Romeo and Juliet-ish kind of love song. Let me read a little bit of it to you, and then we can listen to it. Here's how it goes. Schein wie die Levona, schein wie die Levona, lichtig wie die Stern von Himmel am Matona. Beautiful as the moon, like the moon in beauty, like the shining starlight. You too were sent from heaven, a gift to my night. And then it goes on. The best of luck caressed me. When finding you possessed me, like thousand suns you blessed me. You filled my heart with light, with your teeth so bright, just like pearls so white, with your beauty, your eyes such a beauty, with your dainty hands, with your gorgeous hair. I'm now all your booty. Not booty in the 21st century, booty meaning your prize. So there was a lighter side to this music, as there was a more intense side to this music, but it was all part of this explosion of Yiddish culture and Yiddish music percolating in these immigrant Jewish neighborhoods. So let's listen to a little bit of Sheina Vide Levona. This is a more recent recording performed by the Israeli stage actor Dudu Fisher about 20 years ago.
Schein wie die Levona, beautiful as the moon.
Thank you. Obviously, that wasn't Dudu Fisher. That was Eliza Alberts. I put the other clip there by mistake, but you get the basic idea. And you get a sense this was a more recent performance, but the way it was originally performed, I couldn't find the link to that, would have looked the same on the Yiddish stage, with a full orchestra, with elaborate costumes and elaborate performance, like Colonel noted, yes, throwing some blues notes maybe because that was up in the air. You know, these were Jews who are encountering different musical styles. Pardon the barking. But yes. Now, all of this is unfolding at a particular moment. And I think maybe one of the questions that's on your mind is that, you know, did this Yiddish musical tradition, musical theater, was it affected by, well, the change in the Yiddish language? Because remember, we're talking about a period in time where between the first generation and the second generation of Jews in America, Yiddish undergoes a real profound change. In other words, the Jews who came from Eastern Europe, Yiddish was their first language, and for many, Yiddish remained their only language. If you came to America, if you lived in an immigrant neighborhood where everyone spoke Yiddish, and you went to work where everyone spoke Yiddish, that could simply be your language, and that was a natural audience. The children of that generation who grew up, the ones who weren't working in the shops, who actually were able to go to school, they became English speakers very, very quickly. It's one of the great success stories of that first generation is they enabled their children to go to school and in many cases to graduate high school and even go to college. But part of that also was that second generation really became bilingual, even more so than their parents. That generation that grew up and reached adulthood in America, their language became English. And what did this mean for their interest in the Yiddish theater? Well, you might think that, you know, as they encountered American culture, they just lost interest in Yiddish. That was not true. It would take another generation. There was a whole generation of young people, even though they became American as their parents wanted them to be. And Yiddish became, let's say, their second first language, whereas Yiddish became their first language. They still maintained a real love, not only for the Yiddish language and a fluency in it, but a real love for Yiddish theater. Because remember, Yiddish theater wasn't just about a language. It was these elaborate, impressive shows. And remember also, at this point in time, there's no Broadway yet. There are uptown shows, but there's nothing elaborate like this. Also because, unlike, let's say, the opera, this Yiddish theater, this musical theater would have more formal songs, but would also incorporate a lot of folk music and a lot of tunes that everyone would know and sing along with. When you went to the opera, if you managed to have enough money and be upwardly mobile enough to get a ticket to the Academy of Music or then the Metropolitan Opera, you weren't singing along. You were sitting properly and listening. In Yiddish theater, these were these wonderful shows, but the audience was more part of the show. And young people growing up, partly because of nostalgia, partly of routine, but partly because this was really good music and really impressive performances, they really retained a very close connection. And we see this in the first generation of Jewish performers, Jewish musicians in America who are really becoming more Americanized and English speaking as they are old worldly and Yiddish speaking. They're still very much part of this world. And some of the original Jewish musicians and actors who become part of the stage in a larger world, they're young performers who are reared in this milieu and who still are very much attached to it. And you know, next week we're going to look at some big examples. When we look at Irving Berlin and the Gershwins, they epitomize that. But it's just to give you a little taste of what I mean by this segue from the world of Yiddish theater to this broader world of making an impact on American culture. Let's look at the example of Eddie Cantor. Eddie Cantor is a great example because he really did grow up in this world. He was shaped by this world. The first music he heard, whether it was in the street, whether it was in the home, whether it was going to theater, was Yiddish music. This was a boy who, we don't have to hear Eddie Cantor say it. He definitely knew all the music we play tonight for sure. He heard Mein Ruhe Platz. He knew this music. He was reared. It was second nature. He could easily perform it, and a lot of it he did perform. And as he got into the world of acting, as he developed an interest in being a singer and a performer, the first step in that direction, before he ever thought of being an actor on a big stage, first he thought of about being a Yiddish actor. That was the most familiar. It was the most proximate. And he flirted with that idea. Now, eventually he did move beyond. And eventually many Jews from the old neighborhood were able to move beyond all of this into that larger world. But I want to give you one example of Eddie Cantor and people of that generation as a kind of transitional figure from that older world of Yiddish music and Yiddish theater into that burgeoning world of American culture where Jews are going to bring Jewish music and into it. And this is a song that Eddie Cantor recorded in 1920 called Lina Palestina. Now, Palestina, of course, is in reference to Palestine. All right. Now, the fact that he recorded it in 1920 was not simply a coincidence. It actually is a very timely one, because if you know anything about the outlook, the mindset of American Jews, first and second generation American Jews in early 20th century America, that the idea of Zionism and a connection to Israel comes to them very slowly. So let me say a word about this, and then I can recite to you a little bit of this song, Lina Palestina, and we can listen to a little bit of it. Until the year 1913, there were some Jews who became Zionists, but not many in America. The number of American Jews who had become Zionists before 1913 was relatively small, just a few thousand, for a number of reasons, which may be apparent to you. These were Jews who had moved a great distance from Eastern Europe to America. It was a difficult journey and transition, and then to embrace an ideology and a movement which was asking them to leave and move again was very difficult. Also, many of these Jews, one of the things they wanted to do was to not only become American, but to be accepted as American by a larger world of American society and culture. And embracing a movement which said Jews don't really belong here was simply not that palatable to that many Jews. They were much more interested in the practical and taken by the practical challenges of creating a life in America. And Zionism at first just wasn't quite resonating with them. Now, all this changed in many ways because of a single individual whose name was Louis Brandeis. Now, Brandeis is funny, and it's actually almost ironic that he's part of this story, because Brandeis was not an Eastern European Jew. He was from a Jewish family that had come decades before, from German Central Europe. He was part of that old American elite. He didn't live in New York. He lived in Kentucky. He lived in Louisville, Kentucky. He didn't have much of a Jewish identity. He was basically an assimilated American Jew who also happened to be a very successful lawyer before he became the first Jew on the Supreme Court. And not only was he a successful and capable lawyer, he became really the first high-profile lawyer in America to defend labor unions. He really became the first labor lawyer in American history. He was the one who convinced the courts that unions were legal. And so he worked very closely with unions. Now, his work with the unions brought him into contact, really for the first time, those Eastern European Jews who had worked in the sweatshops and who had organized, for example, the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, who Brandeis represented. And in his encounters with these Jews from Eastern Europe, he had a kind of renaissance of Jewish identity. He was very impressed by that traditional flavor, by the richness, the thickness of Jewish identity in Eastern Europe, as opposed to his own Jewish identity, which was thinner. It just simply wasn't as impressive. Now, he's not someone who wanted to become religious. So in his own sort of journey of rediscovery as a Jew, what really drew him was Zionism, which is a long way of saying that, a roundabout way of saying that in 1913, Louis Brandeis became a Zionist. And he was also the most high-profile Jew in America, soon to be on the Supreme Court. When Brandeis became a Zionist, several 100,000 American Jews became Zionists, joined the movement within the next few months. Brandeis made it, I don't know how to say it, made it kosher for American Jews to be Zionists. And one of the reasons is that Brandeis was insistent that being a Zionist was not inconsistent with American patriotism. One of the ideas that Brandeis helped, concepts that he helped formulate, was what we would now call a hyphenated identity. He said you could be Jewish and American at the same time. It wasn't an either or proposition. You know, he gave a speech on this in 1913 in which he said that in the same way that Irish Americans can help fight for Irish home rule in Ireland without compromising their patriotism, we Jews can join a movement wanting to build a Jewish state in Palestine without compromising our loyalty to America. He made it palatable, and he helped with that transition. And suddenly, Zionism slowly, increasingly became more a mainstream part of American Jewish identity. And even by 1820, that's what the song Lena Palestina is about. So let me read a little bit of it to you. It's sort of it tells the story of a young Jewish girl whose name is Lena. Let me read a little bit of it. In the Bronx of New York City lives a girl. She's not so pretty. Lena is her name. Such a clever girl is Lena. How she plays a concertina. Really, it's a shame. She's such a good musician. She's got a swell position to go across the sea and entertain. So they shipped poor Lena way out to Palestina. From what I hear, now she don't look the same. In other words, she became a Zionist. She moved to Israel, and now she looks different. They say that Lena is the queen of Palestina just because she plays a concertina. She only knows one song. She plays it all day long. Sometimes she plays it wrong, but how they love it, want more of it. I heard her play once or twice. Oh, murder tune, it was nice. All the girls, they dressed like Lena. Some wear oatmeal, some farina, down old Palestina way. Lena's girlfriend, I love this part, Lena's girlfriend, Arabella, let her meet an Arab fella that she thought was grand, on a camel's back a-swaying. You can hear Miss Lena playing over the desert sand. She didn't play that new one, for all she knew was blue ones. Still, Yusuf sat and listened in his tent, and as he tried to kiss her, she heard the Arab whisper, oh, Lena, play your instrument. Lena is the queen of Palestina just because she plays a concertina. She only knows one song. She plays it all day long. Sometimes she plays it wrong, but how they love it, want more of it. It became a kind of iconic figure. Now, this isn't Eddie Cantor saying, let's all become Zionists and move, but this is it becomes a familiar cultural figure in this world of music. So let's listen to just a minute or two of it. I think the recording we have, the recording with Eddie Cantor singing, it wasn't always clear. I have another one. This might just be the instrumental accompaniment. So, all right, let's just listen to about a minute of that, and I'll wrap up here. This is the tune that accompanies what I just wrote.
In the Bronx of New York City lives a girl, she's not so pretty. Lena is her name. Such a clever girl is Lena, how she plays a concertina. Really, it's a shame. She's such a good musician, she got a swell position to go across the sea to entertain. And so they ship poor Lena way out to Palestina. But now I hear that she don't look the same. They say that Lena is the queen of Palestina just because they like her concertina. She plays it day and night. She plays with all her might. She never gets it right, but how they love it, want more of it. I heard her play once or twice. Oh, murder, still it was nice. She was fat, but she got leaner, pushing on her concertina. Down old Palestina way. Just because they like her concertina. Each movement of her wrist just makes them shake and twist. They simply can't resist. Her music's funny, gets the money. There's nothing sounds like it should. So rotten, it's really good. All the girls, they're dressed like Lena, somewhere oatmeal, some farina, down old Palestina way.
Now, all of that is really going to set the stage for what we're going to talk about next week, because all of that is going to be taken a step further as Jewish composers and singers and performers begin to move out of the Yiddish world of the Lower East Side and move into the larger world of musical culture in America, oftentimes bringing some of this Jewish music with them. And you can hear in this tune, it has these Hasidic idioms in it. Eddie Cantor is singing some of the tunes he heard growing up, woven into this song. And so this larger world we're going to turn to next week. At this point, let me pause and see. I see some interesting comments in the chat. I want to see if there are any questions. Okay. I don't see any questions there. But look, so what we're going to do, where we're going to start next week is we're going to see especially how Irving Berlin, who of course wasn't born Irving Berlin, who was born Isidor Balin, and how two brothers named George and Ira Gershwin are going to take this music and not only going to enter this larger world, they're going to help redefine it. So next week, we're going to talk about, among other things, how is it that a couple of Jewish boys from the Lower East Side are going to write some of the best Christmas music, but also for someone like George Gershwin's going to write the Rhapsody in Blue, and of course Irving Berlin is going to write God Bless America, which almost became the national anthem. How is it that that couple of Jewish boys are able to do that? That we're going to talk about next week. Thank you, everybody.
Terrific. What a great opening session in our month-long series, and in this particular program, the series about American music. Remember, the whole next 2 months are going to focus on the Jewish contribution to American music, television, and cinema. Today's series is about music. Feel free to ask questions if you have anything real quick. We'll try to get to them. So here's a few notes. First of all, if you travel to New York on one or more of CSP's New York adventures, like Ahuva Ho has done, and like Norman and Barbara Rosen has done, know that we always spend Friday morning in the Lower East Side, and we look around for the ghosts of Jewish past. And one of the programs we did was looking into the old theaters that were there. You can still see them; they're hidden there. So the old theaters are there. And one of our trips also, we went to the burial ground. We went to the cemetery in Queens, and in this particular cemetery at different areas. And one of the areas was the famous members of the Yiddish theater. They have their own area, and you can go see Boris Tomaszewski there, and so on and so forth. So it's nice that you tied that into our trips, and I could bring up Barbara and Norman Rosen as well. So I guess one question was, at this time, in the early time of Jewish music in the Lower East Side, did non-Jews go in at all, or was it really just Jewish people going into these theaters in the early days?
Great question. Non-Jews definitely went. And even Jews, even if they spoke not a word of Yiddish, non-Jews went to see the fanfare. Absolutely. It's like in the same way you go to an opera, even if you don't know Italian, You just go to experience the grandeur of it. Yes. Now, most of the audience was Jewish, but particularly people who lived in proximity of the Lower East Side, they would definitely come and do it. Now, the upper class, especially those who lived uptown, they weren't coming downtown to hear this because they weren't coming downtown for anything. But the people who lived in the neighborhood who weren't Jewish, this was part of the fabric of the neighborhood. One of the things we'll see next week in the coming weeks is that these sounds are familiar not only to Jews, but to others as well. And we're going to have this amalgam of Jewish music and African-American music and Latino music, not only by Jewish performers and composers, but by others as well. It's all going to mix together. It's all in the air together. But yes, non-Jews definitely came to see these shows.
Great. And I think people are sending nice emails how much they enjoyed this opening program. There was a question by Joe Simon, and it's kind of the trajectory. So where does this lead first, into vaudeville or Broadway, or both at the same time? So I guess it's a question about trajectories. The stuff you've showed us, was vaudeville going on at the same time, or is that kind of the next step as Broadway is developing?
Well, one of the things we'll see in the next week and the week after, yes, this becomes, when this moves uptown, it changes language and becomes Broadway. Broadway is the result of this. Without this, there is no Broadway. Vaudeville is a little bit more complicated because there were many Jews who were involved in Broadway, in vaudeville, and there were Jews who would come from these performances and become vaudeville actors, but not everyone. Other communities had what became vaudeville as well. Vaudeville is more of an amalgam, but Broadway, as we shall see, really is just taking Yiddish theater and taking it uptown and changing the language, but bringing a lot of the tunes and a lot of the ideas, and certainly the idea of an elaborate play with songs and elaborate orchestra and costumes. That is Broadway, and that came from Yiddish musical theater.
Terrific. I want to read, Janice Kaplan wrote me a message, and she said, regarding the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire, her husband's great uncle defended the owners, while her mother's cousin was a worker in the factory. The cousin, Bessie Cohen, is pictured as the girl who has fainted on the famous poster. I guess I wanted to share that just to show that we have really cool people in our audience who are, I'm happy to have their input, and then they share their own history like that ties into what you've talked about today. So thank you, Professor Lupovitch, for this first program. Thank you, great audience, for your insight, your stories. I will share a follow-up after this program, which will have links to the videos you saw, and as well as the lyrics to the song, so you can sing along, I guess, share them with your friends. But any way you want to join, that's great. Thank you for the handout, Howard. That's it. We'll see you on Sunday. What do we start on Sunday? Is it, Jews in American television, correct? Okay. Different subject in our overall theme. Thanks, everybody. Have a terrific and safe weekend. Keep healthy. A lot of people are getting sick right now, so I don't want you to be sick, because I want you to enjoy the programs. Happy that Martin and Tamar Brower were able to get on, because they are past individuals we've honored in one of our 1 month scholar series. So happy they made it. And it's nice to have Nancy Kaplan, who introduced us to Professor Howard Lupovitch. So, hey, you all look healthy to me. So stay healthy, please. I'll be looking at you a lot the next few months. Chuck Chatlin, it's always nice to have you as well. Okay, everybody, take care. Bye, Harrison Jen. Bye, Deborah. Happy Thursday, everybody. Bye, Rubens. Good to see you. Hey, Faith and Rosalie as well.